Good evening, all, and good morning to those who are joining us from the other part of the world. Uh, this is hello and a warm welcome from Office of International Partnerships at Shiv Nadar University. Thank you all for joining us tonight in this challenging times, sending you lots of hopes and warm wishes for your family members and your community members. Let's stay strong, and I'm sure we'll dive this through. Tonight we have Dr. Pauline Rose with us and a moderator for the session, Dr. Partha Chatterjee, who's the Dean for International Partnerships and Head of the Economics Department at Shiv Nadar University. He's the man behind this whole series, Beyond Boundaries, which we did even last year and continued doing this year. And he basically ideated and conceptualized the whole series. So you'll be hearing more from Dr. Chatterjee in this 1 hour. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements. There is a Q&A and chat box on your screen. So in case you have any queries, type in your queries on that and we'll be taking those towards the end of the session. Thank you all, and over to you, Dr. Chatterjee.
Thank you, Arshita. And again, I know this is a difficult time here in India right now, and I hope you're staying safe and all their loved ones are safe around you. But today we are going to talk about another very, very important aspect of this, COVID, might throw up in the post-COVID days, right? So this is something that can have a really long-lasting impact. It's how the education inequality shapes up, or in some sense, even just lost access and all of it, right? So I'm very, very delighted that we have one of the leading persons who's researching in this area with us today. It's Professor Pauline Rose, who's the professor at Cambridge University, as well for international education, as well as the director for research for Equitable Access and Learning Center, REAL. Yeah, there's need to keep it real, right? So she is also the senior research fellow at UK Department for International Development. Prior to joining Cambridge, she was the director for EFA Global Monitoring Report, during which time she directed 2 reports on youth, skills and work, and on teaching and learning. She also worked as a policy analyst, and in that she has worked on themes of governance, marginalizations, and conflict. She was earlier with University of Sussex. She has written numerous publications, and I'm not obviously going to get into that. You can go to her website. It's really, really impressive. And she has examined various issues of educational policy and practice, including relation to inequality, financing, and governance, as well as democratization and the role of international aid. Right? She has worked in a variety of countries in sub-Saharan Africa as well as South Asia. And with that, I will let Dr. Rose take over and talk about today's really important issue of inequality in education.
Thank you so much for the invitation and introduction, and also my warm wishes to everybody around the world, and particularly in India at this time. I'm going to share my screen with my PowerPoint, and if anyone has any problems in seeing or hearing, please do say. So my focus of this presentation is going to be on addressing education inequality. It says in the post-pandemic world. I'm not sure when we're going to be in a post-pandemic world, sadly. So it's in the sort of, I guess, up and down in the pandemic world. As was just introduced, I am the director of the REAL Centre. I'm also co-director of the Cambridge Global Challenges Strategic Research Initiative at the University of Cambridge. This strategic research initiative brings together academics, researchers within Cambridge, as well as partners in the Global South from a number of different countries working on related topics across disciplines and subject areas, in particular with the aim of identifying ways to ensure that evidence informs the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in relation to that particular role, we have an active group of researchers who come together on a fortnightly basis to discuss the research that is going on across the university related to COVID. So there's, as one might expect, a lot of research that's going on across low and low middle income countries, with colleagues in Cambridge in partnership with colleagues in different countries around the world. And this is a snapshot and just an example, because there's far more than one can see on this map here. But just as an example, there's some regional projects across different countries, such as looking at the role of philanthropy models in emerging markets in the context of COVID-19, the translation of the WHO recommendations into African languages, which is obviously hugely important. I won't go through everything that you can see on the map, but there's a lot of health-related activities and work that's going on. 3 projects in particular in India that are identified here. One around low-cost ventilation designs and configuration. One that is looking at machine learning policy analysis. Another looking from a more sociological perspective on women's working from home in the context of COVID-19 in Delhi. And we could certainly connect anyone who's interested in those with the researchers who are working on them. What I'm going to be focusing on today is the bit in red on this screen, the effects on education. And I'm afraid although I have worked with colleagues in India, my sort of most recent expertise is not in India, so I'm going to be focusing primarily on Ethiopia. And I think I'd be really interested to hear some of the ways in which you think maybe some of the issues that I'm saying might be similar or different in the context of India. From work that we're doing across different countries, there's a lot of synergies, of course, with very important contextual differences. I will also be providing a bit of a global overview, or particularly an overview of countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So moving then on to the focus on education. Even prior to COVID, there's been huge concerns that many of the most disadvantaged children have not been completing primary school. So in India, as in other countries, there's been a very large increase in enrollment and access to education. And India has perhaps surpassed many other countries in ensuring that children are in primary school and are completing. But amongst these children, there are still many who are not making it to the end of primary school. And amongst these, even with some of those who are in primary school, they are not able to read or write or do the basics. So there's very large numbers who are not achieving the basics. So this was even prior to COVID. So just to give a quick snapshot, on this graph, you can see a number of different countries. India isn't included because we didn't have the comparative data of household survey data that this graph draws on for India. Not to say that those data don't exist, but it wasn't from the same source of data, demographic and health survey data that we had access to. So the red dots at the top are for the richest urban males. So this is the proportion of the richest urban males who are completing primary school. And you can see in a number of countries, there's quite high rates of completion, nearing 100%, i.e. nearing all of them completing. However, you can see the orange dots at the bottom, and there's quite a wide gap between the red and the orange dots, with the orange dots relating to the poorest rural females. And what you can see there is that in a number of countries, it's only around a half or a third of these most disadvantaged, and poverty being the main driver of that limited access and completion. And even on the right-hand side of the graph, as few as 6 to 10% of children in these countries who are completing primary school. So a huge challenge still remains for making sure that all children do complete primary school, despite this being a real national and global priority, even since we've had the Millennium Development Goals, let alone the Sustainable Development Goals. This inevitably impacts on the access to secondary education. So this graph shows the extent to which children and young people in these same countries are completing secondary school. And again, you can see on the left-hand side of the graph, some countries that are doing relatively well, but far more countries where even for the most advantaged in those countries, there are still around only 2/3 or 3/4 who are completing secondary school. So we know that in many countries, in order to access good jobs, you need to be able to have completed secondary schools to get the relevant skills and qualifications. Yet the sort of ability of many children to complete secondary school remains limited. When we look at the most disadvantaged, again, the orange dots on this graph, we can see that in many countries, there's just a very small proportion of these young people who are getting to the end of secondary school. So real lack of opportunities for education, which continues to hold back opportunities in the future as well. And as I said, this is pre-COVID. We obviously don't have all these data yet in the COVID context, but we can anticipate that things will be getting worse, if anything. As I mentioned, as we sort of know that even if for those children who are out of school and haven't spent at least 4 years in school, it's very unlikely that they would have achieved the basics in just reading and mathematics and numeracy. But what is of perhaps also concern is that for children who have been spending at least 4 years in school, many of these children are also not learning the basics. So in total, this estimate is from a little while ago, but there have been updates and the figures haven't changed substantially. Around 250 million children globally are not learning the basics. Around half of these 250 million children have spent at least 4 years in school. So the reasons for this vary as to why children are in school and not learning. Sometimes it can be to do with the quality and the relevance of the education. It can be to do with class sizes, over 100 children in the class in some contexts. But it also can be to do with pressures in the home which mean that children are absent for periods of time or are tired when they're in school if they've also got a lot of home responsibilities that again can affect girls and boys differently and can impact on the poorest in particular. So this is an example from India, and some of you might be aware of the ASA data in India. There's some similar data in other countries as well, which has been assessing learning in just very basic literacy and numeracy now for over 10 years and looking at the extent to which children are able, in this case, to do division and read a story. So this is something that children should be able to do within the first 2 or 3 years of being in primary school according to the curriculum. And what we can see in this graph is that if you look on the left-hand side, for the 7-year-olds, we wouldn't necessarily expect them to do division and read a story. So it's not surprising that not many of them are able to do that. But by the age of 9 or 10, we would be expecting to see that they can achieve these basics. What we see is that the blue line, which is the richest girls and boys, that there is an increased proportion of these richest poor girls and boys who are able to achieve these basics. But even amongst these, by the age of 11, less than half have been able to do the basics. So there is a chronic problem for the ability of children to learn the basics, whatever their background. But even greater concern is for those who are amongst the poorest, that they have very little chance of learning these basics, even by the time that they have reached age 11. So by the time a poor girl in rural parts of India have reached the age of 11, only 7% of these poor girls have achieved the basics. And you can see here that there's both big difference between the blue line and the red line, which is to do with poverty, but also a gap emerging between girls and boys. So a huge challenge, and this isn't at all unique to India, I should say. This sort of pattern one can see in many different countries. So we did look at some of the related data in different countries for which it was available, looking at the beginning of the Sustainable Development Goal era in 2015 and what progress would be needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal of all children learning the basics by 2030. And what you can see here is that for all these countries, the blue line, there's still a way to go for the richest. So the blue line, there is a sort of starting point. None of them are very close to 100. Kenya is the closest. But the red line shows an even steeper need for an increase in in learning the basics. So a real challenge. And if one looks at the latest data, that we now have for 2020, I don't think we're on track with what was happening even before COVID. So a huge challenge that already existed, and a lot of effort and energy that's been put in by governments around the world to try and accelerate progress, but still, given the extent to which progress was needed, still a long way to go. So then moving on to the effects of COVID and the concern that that this will be undermining the basics. As we know, in many countries around the world, if not almost all countries around the world, schools have been closed for a period of time as a result of COVID, and sometimes they've closed, reopened and closed again. So the sort of disruption is likely to continue, and even where schools have opened, obviously there are sort of variety of constraints within which they're able to open. So in terms of the expectations, some of which we don't yet know the full picture, but it's anticipated that dropout is likely to increase further, and that is likely to impact the most disadvantaged in particular. That there's an expectation that children who had been able to sort of make some progress with learning the basics are likely to have fallen back on that, partly because they've been out of school for a period of time, as well as we know that when schools are closed, including, for example, just over school summer holiday times or school closure times that are part of a usual cycle, that they lose some of their skills in normal circumstances. And this is likely to have an even greater impact with the longer periods of time that schools have been closed. So there's quite a lot of research that's going on at the moment to try and look at these two things about dropout and learning loss. And we're doing some work in Ethiopia. I'll come on to that a little bit later. And other colleagues are doing it in other countries around the world as well. Part of the reason why this is likely to affect the most disadvantaged the most is because we know that there's very strong unequal access to education technology during school closures. So many countries have put on radio or television programs to try and support children's learning during school closures. Sometimes there have been attempts for sort of continue learning through different forms of technology by connecting the teachers with the students, but this varies a lot in terms of who gets access to these facilities. And also at a very basic level, even before COVID hit, many schools were affected by the lack of basic hygiene facilities, and that this is obviously, even prior to COVID, this was important, but as a result of COVID, this is even more important, not only for schooling, but for broader health and ensuring that the spread of COVID doesn't exacerbate if schools are open. And in some countries, having sufficient classrooms to allow social distancing is also a huge problem. So where there's overcrowded classrooms, the ability to ensure social distancing can be hugely problematic and difficult to achieve. So during the time that Ethiopia had its school closures, so Ethiopia, as you know, is a sort of large country in sub-Saharan Africa, very diverse in terms of language, of geography, etc., and also diverse in terms of the extent to which there's sort of very large numbers of people who are living in poverty, particularly in rural areas. About 3/4 of the population live in rural areas. And so we did a phone survey over the time during which the schools were closed to try and understand the extent to which it was being possible for learning to continue during these school closures, and to get the perspectives of teachers and head teachers about the connections that they were able to continue to have with their students. And so again, at a very basic level, we were sort of identifying the extent to which households and also teachers themselves had access to technology. So this particular graph is about the access of households to technology. And what we can see is that a huge gap in the access between urban and rural areas, as I mentioned, with a large proportion of Ethiopia's population living in rural areas, but only around 58% of that population having access to electricity. And by contrast, the vast majority of the urban population having this. Interestingly, at the other extreme, sort of in terms of internet connection and access to computer and technology, and tablets rather, this was a similar constraint, whether people were living in urban or rural areas. So very little internet connectivity and very little access to computer or tablets. So to the extent that there might be an expectation that children could continue to learn through these means, that wouldn't be possible for the vast majority of children wherever they were living. In Ethiopia, as in many other countries, they put on radio programs to try and support children's learning at the primary school level. But as we can see here, there was very low access to radios in many households. So interestingly, a bit higher proportion of access to radios amongst the rural population, around 54%, compared to 35% in urban populations. We think the reason for this potential higher proportion in rural areas is partly because some of those in urban areas will be able to connect to the radio via their smartphones. They're more likely to have smartphones, and a much higher proportion also have access to television. So then asking teachers and head teachers about identifying what they thought was going to be the ways in which children's education was going to be most affected during the school closures. We also asked questions about the extent to which they were in contact with the students and so on. And they both the school principals as well as the teachers felt that it was going to be these basics in reading and mathematics that were most affected. They also had concerns for children's motivation to learn. Teachers in particular had that concern that, would children lose their motivation for learning to come back to school as a result of this long period of school closure. However, they also felt that there were other really important things that would need to be taken into account in terms of the type of support that children were missing out on, and so would need to have access to both perhaps during school closures, but also to need to pay attention as schools reopened. So across these different population groups, there were a range of different aspects of support that they felt that students would be missing out on. So as we can see here, students from low-income countries, the teachers felt in particular that they would be missing out on school feeding. So there was a school feeding program that isn't national, so unlike in India where there is the sort of more national program, but that the fact that schools were closed, and so these children who, many of whom from these poor families don't have access to enough food at home, they would be missing out on the feeding, that food that they would have otherwise had from attending school. Across many different groups, the students from low-income families, the students who were identified as being low-performing, students in rural areas, they felt also peer-to-peer support would be missing. Of course, schooling isn't only about learning the basics and getting those outcomes, but it's also about the socialization, and that they felt that, amongst a number of these children, that would be an area of particular concern. And similarly, they felt that there'd be amongst the girls and the students from low-performing students in particular, but not only them, that they would also be missing out on emotional and psychosocial support, recognizing that the sort of emotional support was even more important in the context of COVID-19 and the disruptions that they were going to be facing in their homes as well. So education, I think sort of part of the message here is that teachers and households really recognize that schools are not only about the sort of conventional forms of learning, but also have many other important aspects of support that they give to students, which they would be missing out on during this period of school closure, and for which it might be quite difficult to ensure that children can catch up on and reintegrate successfully, and would need to really be taken into account as schools were reopening. So in Ethiopia, teachers identified that very poor students, girls, and those students in rural areas were those that would be most in need of support when schools would reopen for the sorts of reasons that I've been giving. They also suggested that in that particular context, hygiene and safety in the school was going to be a really important strategy for reopening. So it's not to say that there weren't other things such as academic support that were important, but actually overriding this were these more sort of health related issues given the context and given the fact that many of the schools lacked these facilities. The Ethiopian government, as many other governments, has been responding to many of these challenges and trying to sort of do what it can to address them. Now, I'm going to show a couple of graphs which are literally hot off the press, just literally from the last day or two. So partly, forgive me if they're sort of still not in the best of formats, but hopefully they can give a quick picture. So I mentioned at the beginning that there was a concern of the extent to which children would be losing their ability, that some of the learning that they had already achieved in literacy and numeracy. And there are a number of studies that are going on to identify the extent to which this is the case and who is most likely to have been missing out or to have lost some of their learning. So we have been collecting some data with colleagues in Ethiopia. We are in partnership with Addis Ababa University and the Ethiopian Policy Studies Institute to do a study that we've been doing for a number of years before COVID. And so we've built on that study to try and identify what is now happening as the schools have been hit and the students have had to spend some time out of school. So as in other countries, the schools closed in March, they started to reopen in around November time, but they did it in a sort of staggered way. So this is actually a graph that's looking at the pre-primary school age. So that's O class is the pre-primary school age children. And the left-hand graph is those children who weren't in pre-primary school prior to COVID. And the right-hand graph is those who were in pre-primary school prior to COVID. Now, one thing that has surprised us a bit, and the graph that I'll show in a moment, we get the same message, that actually it's not that children have lost their learning, there have been learning gains. So their learning has actually increased at this sort of pre-primary age. So this is a very basic test of recognizing letters and words and numbers and things like this. So it suggests that, you know, they haven't lost what they had already learned, where they'd already learned something, and there is some progress that has been made, taking into account different background of children. But I think one important message is that there is a difference in the extent to which they have been able to sort of ensure that they have achieved these learning gains between those that had spent time in pre-primary school and those who had not. So those that have spent time in pre-primary school were more likely to achieve these learning gains and to a larger extent than those who had not spent time in pre-primary. And this is really important because research prior to COVID has also shown that spending time in pre-primary education has huge benefits for children, and particularly children from disadvantaged backgrounds, in their learning once they reach primary school. So they are much more likely to be able to pick up the basics if they've spent time in pre-primary school once they reach primary school. And this sort of reiterates the importance of investing in pre-primary education. And, you know, having said this, that in the sort of the support that's been given to education during school closures in many countries, including Ethiopia, pre-primary school age children were not the ones that were prioritized. So, I mean, the fact that we're seeing this progress is not a bad thing. Of course, we don't know the counterfactual. We haven't got here how much gains we would have seen had we not had the school closures. Then moving on to sort of related analysis this is from students who started in grade 3 of primary school. And so the wave 1 is grade 3 of primary school, wave 2 is at the end of grade 3 of primary school, and wave 3 is grade 6 of primary school. So this is over time, and it's so wave 1 and 2 is pre-COVID, and wave 3 is after schools had reopened. So there's a gap there in the time between when schools were pre-COVID and then the time when they have reopened. Now, again, one thing that's apparent is that there has been a continued increase in learning. The sort of line is going up. So the left-hand line looks at, the graph looks at girls versus boys, and the right-hand graph looks at rural versus urban schools. So the lines are all going in an upward direction, which is suggesting that there has been learning gains. But I think a couple of important points that come from this, again, very preliminary analysis, so we're still very much work in progress, is that you can see a much steeper learning gain between wave 1 and wave 2, which is at the beginning and end of the school year prior to COVID, and the wave 3, which is where after schools had reopened. So there are learning gains, but they're much slower than they had been. And also, I think really importantly, is the gap that you see between the red and the blue lines in both graphs. So for girls and boys, the gap in learning remains, and of even greater concern in the right-hand graph, the gap between the rural and urban schools not only remains, but if anything might have widened to some extent. And we obviously need to explore this a bit further. So some sort of initial analysis that is emerging, and but we do need to delve into some of the things further in terms of what we're finding. So I think one thing I just wanted to raise is the huge implications this has for public financing. That we know that the effects of COVID-19 is likely to have huge effects on economies around the world, which will affect the reduction in education funding from governments, as well as for aid donors in countries like Ethiopia that receive, reasonable, that most of their funding for education is from their own national resources, but they also do receive support from aid donors. And for those of you who've been watching what's going on in the UK, very sadly today, we sort of heard some of the reality of where the aid funding cuts are going to be hitting, and that will include in education. So that was one of the today's announcements as a result of the cut in aid. So it's both, recognizing that the reality is going to be a reduction in funding, both from national and international resources. Of course, we need to continue to put pressure on governments and aid donors not to cut back on this funding, but also to think about the distribution of the funding. So again, this is prior to COVID, but what we see in this graph is that many countries spend far more on their richest children than they do on their poorest children. So at the top of the graph, we see Nepal, which would suggest that for Nepal, around $100 spent on a rich child, $100 is also spent on a poor child. Now, that might sound, okay, that sounds quite good, but actually given the sort of additional disadvantages that the poor children face, one would expect, if anything, that they would receive a larger part of the public purse. At the bottom end of the graph, of even greater concern, we can see that countries like Liberia, Congo, Guinea, and Malawi, that the poorest receive less than $10 for every $100 that the richest receive. So huge inequalities there. And this is partly related to the extent to which children from the poorest households are able to get access to primary and secondary school, and the costs of the type of education that they receive at those different levels. In many countries, there have been different national policies around distributing funding to make sure that the resources do reach the populations most in need. So a pro-equity funding formula that's in place. So India is here as one example where additional funding to states with higher proportion of disadvantaged groups has been in place. Again, this is prior to COVID, and many other examples of whether it's to do with giving grants, particularly to orphans, or transferring funds to schools in districts where there's a larger population, out of school population. So a number of positive examples. Unfortunately, they're not, these sorts of pro-equity funding formula aren't used as much as they could and should be, and they're often quite tied in terms of the type of spending that they relate to. So I think sort of building on these positive examples to see how can we make sure that funding is distributed to reach those parts of the populations within countries that need it the most, recognizing the stretch of funding that's going to be available. And this approach links very much to the message of an Education Commission report that came out a few years ago that brought together many different experts across the world to sort of give some messages about what we needed to achieve a learning generation, as it was called. So one of the messages of this report was around the need for a progressive universalism approach, giving priority to children most at risk of being excluded from learning, so that unequal opportunities in one generation would not lead to unequal outcomes for the next. And this would imply strongly favouring the allocation of public funding to the lower levels of the education ladder, and within that to those left behind because of poverty, disability and social disadvantage, for example. More recently, again, a number of different national and international organisations have come together to reinforce this message of the need for progressive universalism in the context of COVID-19. So to put the pressure on aid donors as well as national governments to really focus on those most in need with the public resources. So just to conclude, I've given a bit of a whistle-stop tour and I'm going to be very happy to take some questions, but I think, really key to thinking about education, whether we're talking about the post-pandemic world or the continued pandemic world that we're experiencing, I think the sort of key message is that we know that many children are still not learning the basics in primary schools. Many of them are not making it to the end of primary schools. So we still need to continue to prioritise public resources to these primary levels and to lower primary grades. That's not to say that we neglect secondary education and higher education. They're obviously hugely important as well, but one's got to sort of think there are limited resources, and how do we balance those limited resources? Within the types of approaches that we need to think about for those primary grades, we need to think about really making sure that curriculum is focused on the basics. This doesn't mean excluding things like the importance of thinking about peer-to-peer support, socio-emotional learning and so on, but alongside this to make sure that children are really learning the basics in literacy and numeracy. Many countries have overloaded curriculums trying to sort of do lots of different things, which means that children come out not learning anything. Alongside this, we know that those family members who aren't literate themselves, who haven't had experience of education, who are living in poverty, are less likely to have access to education technology. We know that even as schools reopen, we're still likely to need a blended learning approach where families and household members can support children's learning at home. So we need to think about ways that we can bridge this gap and support those family members who currently aren't in a position to give the full support that they want to and would need to at home. As these schools are reopening, there's going to be pressure on schools and teachers to do a lot more than what they were doing previously. And many teachers, again, have already been overstretched. There's got a huge task that teachers face, many of whom in quite challenging circumstances. But in addition to those normal tasks, they now need to sort of be addressing helping children to catch up with their learning loss where this has happened, particularly those from more disadvantaged backgrounds, support children's mental health and other challenges that they face. And teachers can't necessarily do this alone, and they don't necessarily themselves have the skills and backgrounds, so need to think about how best schools and teachers can support this. At a very basic level, to make sure that schools do have the hygiene in place, the hand washing facilities, masks and sanitizers, and that where necessary that these are provided to the poorest. And to pay particular attention across all of this to those most at risk in rural areas, the poorest girls, children with disabilities, and so on. As children progress through the system, there's also a continued need to target approaches to tackle the obstacles that particular groups face that can often also be related to poverty and discrimination. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. Let's go back to the good news. I think that's been one of the most surprising results in this today's talk, that the learning has not really gone down, it has increased a little bit. So what do you think has contributed to it? Is it spending more time with parents, family members, or radio programs, or what? Have you been able to look at it at all? That what was the reason that learning did continue, particularly in the pre-primary, right? So
Yeah, so I think, I mean, literally, as I said, these graphs are hot off the press this week, so we haven't had time to fully explore them. But I think the implications that you're raising are potentially ones that, you know, the Ethiopian government has really tried to put in place support through radio programs that might well have benefited some of the children, as well as the sort of support within the household to try and keep learning going. And it hopefully also indicates the desire for households and communities to see that education is important and to have maintained the momentum even during the school closures. So there could be a variety of reasons, but that's just some initial thoughts.
okay. I mean, that's very important that what you said, that, you know, because one of the things that in your earlier survey, the teachers had pointed out that people might just drop out because of lack of motivation, right? So I think some of these results, and you know, that might actually counter that, right?
Yeah, and actually from those pre-primary school analysis, one thing I didn't show, but the vast majority of the children who had been in pre-primary school did return to school. So about 92% of them returned to school. We've had a quick look at the characteristics of those who dropped out. There's not a sort of clear pattern, I mean, slight pattern of those that are from poorer backgrounds, but yeah, so again, that's again quite a positive story, and it could again be thanks to the way in which the Ethiopian government has really really put the messages out there as this being important, and communities valuing education as well.
But going back to that graph again, what is very evident is being in a pre-primary education really helps, because the gain is much more for them who have had that education. But now clearly, I mean, people who have not been into the system, they are going to lose out. So will that have a long-term impact? How do we deal with that? How do we mitigate that? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as with many other countries, it's the part of the issue is that many children already weren't in school, and they're not very likely now to return. So I think this is why the approach is, again, Ethiopia has this, but other countries do as well, to what's called accelerated learning programs, where there are programs for children who aren't able to attend formal schools, but can go to classes and sessions in a sort of more informal, non-formal context, and a more flexible type of approach to learning, that they can actually again achieve those basics in literacy and numeracy. And where those programs exist, it's shown that the children can really benefit and increase their ability to read and write and do the basics in numeracy and literacy. Again, that's been evidence from pre-COVID times. The numbers of children that are likely to need those sorts of programs is likely to increase. And so one of the challenges is that they're often quite small scale. They're run by non-governmental organizations, supported by aid funding, so quite vulnerable to aid cuts. So given that those are programs that really reach some of the most marginalized who aren't able to go to school, that's something I think really needs attention in this post-pandemic world as well.
Let's talk a little bit about, you know, impact across genders. Africa is, of course, a little different than India in terms of gender discrimination, male child preference, and so on. And the fear here in particular has been, and is that it will impact the girls much more than the boys. And typically, anyway, the achievements of the girls in terms of literacy, etc., are much lower anyway. So do you see that in Africa at all, or do you fear that will happen there? Or again, and coming back to India, because you also have worked on India and are aware of India, do you think there will be much more impact on the girl children, and how do we again deal with it?
Yeah, so again, some evidence from others. I think there's a sort of number of things that comes up. Is one, so there's, for example, the Young Lives survey that colleagues might be aware of that has taken place in parts of India, but also in Ethiopia. And another study on the Adolescent Girls Initiative. And both of those have really highlighted issues around the domestic burden that is often higher for girls, in particular from poorer families, that girls in particular, adolescent girls, are less likely to have access to mobile phones than their male counterparts. So to the extent that is how they're accessing information, they have less access to that information. And also, very sadly, during times of school closures and the sort of people staying at home, there's experience of heightened abuse and harassment, often more at the expense of girls. And for girls also, during the COVID times, increases in early marriage of girls getting married at an early age, in a context where households are thinking, well, you know, they're unlikely now to go back to school, the opportunities are limited, and this is so there's been an increase in marriage of girls as well. So a number of different factors that might directly or indirectly impact on girls' learning to a greater extent than boys.
Well, I must say that some anecdotal things that I have read and talked to some people in rural schools here in India, this time they are actually also observing large number of dropouts among male children because of the income loss. And if you have seen the Pew report, I don't know if you've seen that, in India, about 75 million people have slid back to poverty. So that will eventually have a huge impact on education, because the elasticity is, they're very related, right? So, and we have seen even in your graphs that more marginalized have lower outcomes in education, right? So, and again, the government funding will also be stretched. Already the governments are cutting back, domestic governments as well as foreign aid. How do we deal with this? And what is the role of maybe philanthropy? I don't know, putting pressure on government, of course, but what else? So are there any ways that you can think that we can deal with this kind of income loss and therefore their impact on education?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, as you're saying, it's sort of very cyclical, isn't it? I mean, sort of income loss leading to reduced education, which is going to have a longer term impact in terms of the economies and so on. I think sort of specifically on the role of philanthropy, I mean, education, there has been, I guess, an increasing role that philanthropy has been playing. And I know, I've been, as I said, you're far more familiar with the Indian context, and there's a lot of national philanthropists who are doing, I think, quite wonderful work, working in supporting government schools, for example, and as well as through NGO programs. I think one thing that can be a bit disappointing in international philanthropy is that education doesn't feature very highly. So there's quite a skew, and not to say that health isn't hugely important, but the sort of difference between what is spent on health and education, it's minute on education. There's more recently, Bill Gates and Melinda Bill Gates Foundation has started to put money into education, but it's minuscule compared to what they spend on health. There's other foundations, such the international landscape, such as the MasterCard Foundation and some others, who are funding education. But I think would need to be a real step change if they were to be achieving the shifts that are going to be needed. So I think ultimately it is going to fall on the shoulders of national governments. And that's why sort of thinking about the distribution of funding, I think, is hugely important.
A kind of a related question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. What in India, there's a large private sector in school education, right? And I mean, what role will they play? Because there are two aspects of it. One aspect of it is that there's a great degree of variation among the private schools. And the second aspect is that, expense per children in private school on an average is actually lower than government schools. So now, and they're dependent on tuition, of course, tuition fees. So now, what role do they play? Or, the impact on them also, maybe.
Yeah, so again, there's been some sort of evidence starting to come out that and some people who've been tracking what's been happening in private schools in low middle income countries, and in particular what are commonly known as the low fee or low cost private schools that are intended to sort of serve the poorer populations. And some of these have had to close down as a result of COVID. So they are more susceptible to the impact of COVID, of, where they haven't been able to, obviously households aren't going to be able to pay their fees while the schools have been closed. And even when they reopen, the fact that, as you were saying just now, that impact on households' income will have been affected, so they can't afford those fees. So I think we might be seeing a shift in the extent to which private schools have been able to continue. Maybe they will re-emerge again, but that has been one of the things that has been affected. So in principle, they have a huge, in countries like India, quite a large proportion of the population are attending these types of schools, the low-fee private schools. But yeah, I think that is a cause for concern, and I think we don't know fully what the impact has been. So.
Yes, again, I mean, the role of government and government funding in education becomes so much more important, and we'll have to see how that evolves. Let's take some questions from the audience, and I see both in chat as well as the Q&A. So let me just scroll through. Give me a minute. So I think there's a question on female education, which we kind of addressed. So we move on. Yeah, then there's a question about not having social interaction, and things like dance and other kind of activities, and which are really important in particularly school education, right? And those not happening. How will that impact, and technology bridge that gap? So
yeah, I think sort of an ongoing debate again, sort of prior to COVID, is why weren't we using technology more in education? There is something called the EdTech Hub, which Cambridge, along with a number of different partners around the world, are part of, which is now trying to look at the sort of innovations in technology to try and support learning. And this started again prior to COVID. But I think the debate has also always been very much that technology cannot replace education. It can support, and it can sort of probably do far more than has been happening in schools, but education is far more than just that learning. And so how the school closure, I think so there's a lot of discussion about the effects on children's mental health, and because they have lost out on the social interactions amongst other things. But as to what the actual implications have been, I think it's too early to say as yet, but I think that's really important to be looking at. And I think there are a number of studies also that are looking into that.
Okay, so far we have been talking about developing countries, and there's a question about more developed countries like UK and the impact on the disadvantaged section there. And particularly, I think, if we put the context of increasing inequality that we have seen even before COVID. So your thoughts on that, maybe?
Yeah, so other colleagues in my faculty have been looking at these sorts of issues, and I think the sort of types of issues that I've been talking about are very similar. I mean, the extent to which they have been hitting children and young people might differ, and the access to technology is also likely to differ. But there is a similar concern about the extent to which children are going to be able to retain their learning, the concern about learning loss, etc. I think less likely that the access side of it is less of an issue because of the sort of compulsory education that children would be fined, or parents would be fined, and if they're not going to school. So it's a bit of a different situation in terms of the access, but in terms of learning, very similar types of discussions that have been held, and the sort of evidence that's been captured.
So a question from me in that respect. So how important do you think to have compulsory education in countries? Because this, is something that you're saying that will actually kind of limit the learning loss to certain extent in these countries, right? For example, even in India, we don't have compulsory education. We have the right to education, right? And many developing countries do not have that, right? So do you think that kind of a legislation will help?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tricky one because in countries where which again isn't necessarily the case in India, but where the sort of access to the supply of education is still limited. So there's not a school within close walking distance, for example, and or where the quality of education is so poor that there's reasons why the parents might not be wanting to send their children to school. It is a bit of a debate as to should it be made compulsory. And I think in countries that do have it officially as compulsory, they're not always necessarily able to actually put that into place, because it would be quite difficult to make the argument that parents should be sending their children to school if they just can't access the right types of schools.
All right. I think we can take maybe one more question. And again, there's a bunch of questions about role of technology. That's, of course, there, everyone's mind right now. So do you have any thoughts of how the technology will evolve in future to bridge particularly the rural-urban gap and, gap between different regions, parts of the world?
Yeah, so I think there's been a heightened consideration for trying to make sure that there are programs that can give access to tablets to the most disadvantaged. So there are some aid donor funded projects that have been trying to roll out access to tablets and to radio. I think the sort of vital thing that's come up a lot in the discussions on education technology is to keep it real, to keep it at the sort of basic forms of technology. And that even means, not televisions for many countries and contexts. It does mean radios, it means via basic mobile phones, etc. The types of technology that people have access to and how you can best use those to ensure that there's forms of learning that can continue. I mean, that's both through the interaction between the teacher and the students where that's possible, as well as radio programs on giving sort of different classes, etc. So I think sort of the main lesson that's come up time and time again is about thinking about the basic forms of technology rather than, sometimes technology companies want to do the most whizzy thing, and that's not necessarily the best thing for education.
Right, and even in India, there's been evidence of giving a free laptop has not increased learning. So yeah.
And I think in other countries that's the case as well. One laptop per child has been very expensive and hasn't had a positive effect.
All right, I think we are almost out of time. Thank you. It was a very engrossing, presentation as well as discussion, and I think we could continue for a longer time, but we are running out of time, so we'll stop here today. I really appreciate you taking this time today and being with us and talking about some of the really important issues of, COVID and post-COVID. I don't know when we'll really be into that post-COVID world. I hope sooner than later. And, I again hope that everyone here stays safe and continues to be well. Yeah. And thank you so much.